Hello everyone and welcome to another video. In this video, we're going to be talking about ice and wind deposition. Now, before we talk about specifically ice and wind deposition, I first want to talk about deposition as a whole. Over the course of these videos, we've been talking about changes to the surface of the earth, and we've been talking about three different processes that have occurred over time to change how the earth's surface looks. And those processes are weathering, erosion, and deposition. And even though we see some of these arrows, it is important to note that these three processes occur simultaneously. So while weathering is occurring, while some landforms are being broken down, erosion also is occurring. So some of those pieces are being moved by water, wind, and ice. And as some things are being moved by water, wind, and ice, other ones are being deposited into a new area as well. So even though sometimes we think about it as weathering, then erosion, then deposition, it's important to understand that these three processes are also happen simultaneously throughout different parts of the world. And so first thing I want to talk about today is how wind deposition works. Now, as wind carries particles, it drops them in a new location. And so wind deposition causes a really important thing called sand dunes. And one really cool thing is I want to kind of direct you to the picture at the bottom. And if we look, this is the time-lapse picture of Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado. Now, this picture at the top is from 1973. And the picture on the bottom is from 2011. So a pretty big change of time. Now, I want you guys to kind of look at 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, and 3. Now, if we kind of look, we can see that overall 1, 2, and 3 may have changed a little bit, right? If we look right here, it has a little bit of a point, and here it's a little more flattened out. And here it has a little more of a hump here. And here it's a little more flattened out. And here it kind of looks very similar to this back part. So one of the cool things about Great Sand Dune National Park is a lot of these big sand dunes in the back are constantly still there. So you can always still hike up to these larger parts of Great Sand Dune National Park. But one thing I think is super, super cool, I'm going to try to highlight it or underline it in red. I want you to look at the front of the picture. Look at how there are these bigger sand dunes or more apparent sand dunes. And we see here that they aren't as big. And so one of the cool things about Great Sand Dunes National Park is that a lot of the big steeper areas in the back of the park are kind of always going to be very large. They may change a little bit here and there. However, in the front, it's a constant change of how it's looking. And so if you go to Great Sand Dunes National Park, 5 years different, it's going to look a little bit different than you remember it. And that's because dunes are constantly created as sediments are being deposited and destroyed. So wind erosion, because they're picking up those sediments and moving to the new location as the wind shifts the sand. And so whether it's high winds for a couple of days in different directions or anything like that. So wind deposition can create much amazing things like sand dunes and move a lot of different things over time, depending on how fast and how powerful those winds are. And the second is ice erosion. A lot of times when we think of ice erosion, we think of glacial deposition. And so large glaciers can move boulders and deposit them into new locations. And scientists have discovered that there have been many ice ages over the course of Earth's history. But during the last ice age, glacial boulders were moved hundreds of miles. Now, we talked about how throughout glacial weathering and erosion, um, we talked kind of how they created U-shaped valleys, but also they can create these really cool balancing rocks. Are usually a boulder that traveled on top of a glacier and were deposited in an awkward position. And this is one of the more well-known boulders. This is in eastern Finland. And as we can see, if we really look, I want you to look at this. Look at how it's deposited. Now, that's a huge boulder on top. And the rock at the bottom's pretty big. I mean, it has a pretty round surface, so it's a little easier to balance. But even if we had a super duper powerful crane, it would be hard to get these to balance correctly. And there are so many examples of glacial deposition of these rocks moving and creating these awkward and amazing boulder balancing. Now, this happens in all different types of rocks and all different types of areas. And, maybe some of them aren't as grand or large as this one in Finland, because the locals do call it strange rock because it has this weird balance that only can be explained by glacial deposition. And it is so amazing to see. So, in summary, deposition is the process of materials being deposited or settle into a new area. And deposition works alongside weathering and erosion to constantly change the surface of the earth. When we talk about wind erosion, one of the big things we're talking about as it changes the surface of the earth is by the creation and destruction of sand dunes. And over time, depending on how powerful winds are, it can even change different parts of the surface of the earth. And in glacial deposition, throughout history, among the different ice ages, different rocks have been deposited and traveled hundreds of miles to create these really amazing feats of gravity, really, to create these really awesome boulder balancing acts. So I hope this helps, and I can't wait to see y'all in the next video. Bye, everyone.